When U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris attempted to belittle Burkina Faso's young President Ibrahim Traoré during a high-profile event, the world expected him to stay quiet. But instead, Traoré's calm yet powerful response flipped the script, leaving Harris stunned and the audience in total silence. This unforgettable clash quickly went viral, igniting heated debates across America and beyond. This video captures the shocking exchange, the reactions, and why Traoré's words are being hailed as a defining moment of courage, dignity, and leadership. The hall was packed with world leaders, cameras flashing, and millions watching live across the globe. The air carried a strange tension, like everyone was waiting for something to happen. On stage, U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris adjusted her microphone. Next to her sat a man much younger than most expected, a soldier-turned-leader, the president of the transition of Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traoré. The spotlight seemed unfair. Some thought he didn't belong there. Others whispered he was too young, too bold, too African to be sitting shoulder to shoulder with the world's most powerful. But Traoré sat still, calm, his eyes sharp and steady. Then Harris leaned in, her words sharp as knives. With a smile that wasn't quite a smile, she spoke in a way that made the audience shift in discomfort. Her tone was meant to belittle, to remind the young African leader of his place. Gasps rippled through the hall. Journalists froze mid-scribble. Cameras zoomed in. The world waited for Traoré to shrink back, to swallow the insult quietly. But he didn't. His silence wasn't weakness. It was preparation. And when he finally spoke, everything changed. Kamala Harris's remarks echoed through the hall. She spoke of experience, global responsibility, and knowing when to listen to those who have led longer. The crowd knew what she meant. Traoré was being painted as a child in the room. The insult wasn't just to him. It was to Burkina Faso, to Africa, to the millions of young people watching who had dared to believe that leadership wasn't only for the old and the powerful. Cameras captured his face. No anger, no raised voice, just calm. But behind his steady eyes, something burned. Every word she spoke reminded him of the struggle back home, the sacrifices of his people, the soldiers who fought against terror, the mothers who buried their sons, the farmers who still tilled the soil despite drought and danger. The audience expected him to bow his head, to smile politely and move on. That was the way of politics. Swallow the insult. Protect the alliance. But Ibrahim Traoré wasn't built that way. He didn't fight his way to this stage just to be told he was too small to stand there. And when his turn came to speak, he began with words no one saw coming. He leaned forward slowly, his voice calm, but firm. "Madam Vice President," he began, "I may be young, but my people are not children. Burkina Faso has suffered, bled, and struggled. Yet we rise, not because others tell us how to, but because we know who we are." The room went silent, every camera locked on him. Harris shifted slightly in her chair, her confident smile fading just a little. He continued, his words steady as stone. "Leadership is not measured by age or by how long one sits in power. It is measured by sacrifice. It is measured by how much one is willing to give for their people. If youth is a weakness, then let the strength of our elders guide us. But if courage, honesty, and love for one's people are what matter, then we, the youth, have earned our place." A thunderclap of silence followed. You could hear the faint click of cameras, the shallow breaths of journalists frozen in awe. Traoré didn't raise his voice. He didn't insult her back, but his calm words carried a weight so heavy that even Harris found no reply. The audience knew something unforgettable had just happened. The moment Traoré's words left his lips, the cameras zoomed in. His voice hadn't been raised, but the silence in the room made it echo louder than any shout. Every pair of eyes was fixed on him. Even those who had doubted his presence at the table leaned forward. For the first time in the night, Kamala Harris's polished expression cracked. Her smile trembled. She adjusted her papers as if trying to find balance. But the audience had already noticed. The young African president had shifted the weight of the entire room. Social media lit up instantly. Hashtags began to trend before the event had even ended. #Traoré speaks truth. #Africa rises. #respect Burkina Faso. Clips were uploaded within minutes, watched thousands of times before the speeches were even finished. But what hit hardest wasn't just the words. It was the calm in his eyes, the dignity in his tone. He hadn't insulted her. He hadn't mocked her. He had spoken with a strength born from suffering, a strength many in the audience had forgotten. And in that calm, the world began to realize this was not just another politician. As the event continued, whispers filled the audience. Some leaned close to each other, murmuring in disbelief. Diplomats who had walked into the hall, dismissing Traoré as inexperienced, were now scribbling notes, their faces tight with thought. In the corner, a group of African leaders exchanged knowing glances. They had seen their continent belittled too many times in global forums, but this time felt different. One of their own had stood firm, not with anger, not with arrogance, but with dignity that no one could twist. Meanwhile, American journalists shifted in their seats. Some looked uneasy, others deeply curious. They had expected a routine meeting full of scripted smiles. Instead, they had witnessed something raw and historic. Kamala Harris cleared her throat, trying to regain control, but the hall still buzzed with the energy of what had just happened. Every attempt she made to continue seemed smaller compared to the weight of Traoré's words. In living rooms across the world, families replayed the clip again and again. Children in Africa saw hope. Struggling workers in faraway lands saw courage. And in the crowd, one woman quietly wiped away tears. She knew history had just been written. By the time night fell, the clash had already gone viral. Television networks replayed the exchange on loop. Analysts debating the deeper meaning. Some called it disrespectful to Harris. Others called it the birth of a new kind of leadership. In Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso's capital, streets filled with people cheering. Men pounded drums, women waved flags, and children danced barefoot, chanting Traoré's name. They weren't celebrating against anyone. They were celebrating dignity, the feeling that their voice had finally been heard on the biggest stage. Meanwhile, in Washington, the reaction was split. Some officials whispered about damage control. Others admitted privately that Traoré's calm had exposed something uncomfortable. That truth spoken plainly can cut deeper than politics. On social media, an elderly African-American veteran wrote, "That young man spoke like Martin Luther King Jr. tonight, calm, strong, unshakable." The comment was shared hundreds of thousands of times. But while the world debated, Traoré himself sat quietly in his hotel room. He didn't smile at the praise nor flinch at the criticism. He simply bowed his head in prayer, whispering gratitude for the strength to speak for his people. Tomorrow, he knew the storm would only grow loud. The convoy rolled quietly through the night as Ibrahim Traoré sat in the back seat, his eyes fixed on the city lights fading behind him. His advisors whispered among themselves, their voices heavy with both pride and fear. They knew his words had shaken the world. But they also knew powerful enemies do not forgive being embarrassed on a global stage. Traoré stayed silent, his thoughts far from Washington. He pictured the faces of young Burkinabe soldiers who had died fighting to defend their villages. He thought of mothers who had buried their children with their bare hands. Those memories gave him courage earlier in the hall, and they reminded him now why he could not regret speaking. One of his aides broke the silence. "Excellency, your words will inspire millions, but the backlash will be strong." Traoré turned his gaze toward him. His voice was calm, steady. "If truth has a cost, then I am ready to pay it. But tonight, the world saw that Africa will not bow in silence. The car continued through the dark, headlights carving a path into the unknown storm waiting for him. By morning, America was split down the middle. News channels blazed with heated arguments. One anchor called Traoré a rising leader who exposed hypocrisy with dignity. Another dismissed him as an inexperienced soldier out of his depth. On college campuses, students replayed the clip on their phones. Some stood in admiration, whispering that they hadn't seen such courage in years. Others debated fiercely, questioning whether Harris had gone too far or if Traoré had simply been too bold. Churches, schools, and street corners buzzed with conversations. In barber shops across Atlanta and Detroit, African-American men compared Traoré's calmness to Malcolm X and Dr. King. "The boy didn't flinch," one man said, his voice trembling with pride. But in Washington offices, the mood was colder. Meetings were called. Advisors spoke in hushed tones. Some feared the viral moment would damage America's image. Others feared it might elevate Traoré into a symbol far bigger than Burkina Faso itself. In the midst of this storm, a quiet realization spread. A line had been crossed, and no matter how it was spun, the world had heard something it would not forget. In Ouagadougou, dawn brought tears and celebration. Radios played the recording of Traoré's speech over and over, each word echoing through dusty markets and crowded bus stations. Farmers stopped their work to listen. Mothers held their children tighter, whispering, "You see, our country has a voice." In classrooms, teachers paused their lessons to replay the clip. Children clapped when they heard their president's calm voice stand tall before one of the most powerful leaders in the world. For them, it wasn't just politics. It was dignity. Elderly men who had lived through decades of colonial shadows wept openly. They had seen leaders bow and break. But now they saw something different. A man unafraid, carrying their pain and their pride in equal measure. On the streets, chants rose. "Traoré, Traoré, Traoré," not as a politician, not as a soldier, but as a son of the land who had spoken for them all. Yet behind the joy there was worry. Some whispered of retaliation, of the price that might follow. Still, for that day, hope outshined fear. For the first time in years, the people of Burkina Faso felt unshakably proud. By the third day, the silence from Washington was broken. The White House press secretary stood before flashing cameras, her words carefully measured. She praised the long-standing friendship with Africa. Yet reporters noticed she avoided directly addressing Traoré's viral response. But the questions didn't stop. Journalists pressed harder. Was the vice president's tone appropriate? Does the administration respect young African leaders? The official's smile tightened. "We respect all our global partners," she repeated. But the air in the room was tense. Behind closed doors, Harris faced her advisors. Some urged her to ignore the moment, to let it fade. Others warned it was too late. The clip had become more than an event. It was now a symbol carried by millions worldwide. Meanwhile, in cafes across New York, Washington, and Los Angeles, everyday Americans debated passionately. Some felt pride in Traoré's courage. Others wondered if Harris had underestimated him. The clash was no longer about a hall in Washington. It had grown into a question about respect, dignity, and the power of a young leader refusing to bow. That evening, as Traoré sat by his hotel window, an aide entered carrying an envelope. It was from Burkina Faso. Inside was a handwritten letter from a village elder who had lived through colonial rule and civil unrest. The words were shaky but strong. "My son, you did not speak only for us. You spoke for generations silenced. For once, our children can look to the screen and say, 'We are not small. We are not forgotten. May God give you strength.'" Traoré read the letter twice, his hands trembling slightly. The elder's words carried more weight than any headline or speech. For him, this was the real meaning of leadership. Not applause from the powerful, but tears of hope from the forgotten. He folded the letter carefully, tucking it inside his jacket pocket. His eyes closed as a wave of emotion swept over him. For a moment, the noise of politics faded, replaced by the quiet heartbeat of his people. And with that, he knew whatever storms awaited, he had already won something greater than recognition. He had given his people pride. Back in Burkina Faso, in a small clay house on the edge of Ouagadougou, Traoré's mother sat before a tiny television. The clip of her son played again, his calm words filling the room. Tears streamed down her face as neighbors crowded in, their eyes wide with pride. She whispered softly, "That is my boy. He carries the voice of our land." Children from the neighborhood gathered around her, pointing at the screen. "Mama, is that really him?" they asked, their voices filled with awe. She nodded, clutching her chest as though her heart would burst. Across the country, families gathered in the same way. By radios, by televisions, by phones, they didn't just hear a president. They heard a son, a brother, a neighbor who had stood tall where few dared. The emotion swept through villages and cities alike. People who had lost faith in politics felt a spark of belief again. For once the world had listened to Burkina Faso, and it was through the voice of their own son. And as the night deepened, many wept, not out of sorrow, but out of a pride so strong it felt like freedom. By the fifth day, the debates had grown louder. Television hosts shouted over one another. Some accused Traoré of being too bold for his own good. Others praised him as the kind of leader the world desperately needs. Think tanks and politicians rushed to release statements. Some argued America had lost face, while others quietly admitted Traoré had spoken a truth too many feared to say aloud. Paris and London, newspapers ran front-page stories with headlines like "The Young African Who Stood Tall." In Africa, radio stations carried heated discussions late into the night. Elders compared him to leaders of independence movements, men who had once defied empires with nothing but courage. But backlash followed too. Certain powerful voices hinted at economic consequences. Commentators warned of strained relations. Rumors swirled about hidden pressures being prepared against Burkina Faso. Traoré read these reports in silence. His aides worried, pacing and arguing, but he remained steady as though the storm outside could not touch the calm within him. "Let them speak," he finally said, his voice low. "Truth does not beg for approval. It stands, even when the winds blow against it." That night, long after his team had fallen asleep, Traoré stepped out onto the balcony of his hotel. The city glowed below, restless with noise and light. Yet above him the sky stretched wide, silent, filled with stars. He closed his eyes and whispered a prayer, not for safety, not for praise, but for strength for his people, for the children who would grow up remembering this moment. He thought of the young soldier he once was, carrying only a rifle and a dream of freedom for his homeland. Now he carried something far heavier, the hope of millions and the eyes of the world. As he prayed, he remembered the faces of villagers greeting him with dusty hands and tired smiles, their trust placed in him despite their hunger and grief. That memory brought tears. He could not hold back. "God," he murmured, voice breaking, "let me never fail them." A breeze swept across the balcony, cool and gentle, as though answering his prayer. And in that moment, though alone, Traoré felt the strength of an entire nation standing beside him. The next morning, as Traoré prepared for another meeting, his aide handed him a phone. "Excellency, you should see this." On the screen was a short video gone viral overnight. It showed a little girl in Burkina Faso, no older than 8, standing barefoot in the dirt of her village. She was reciting his words from the event, her small voice trembling, but filled with pride. Leadership is not measured by age. It is measured by sacrifice. Behind her, villagers clapped and cheered, some crying openly. The video spread across the internet like wildfire. Millions watched, moved by the innocence of the child carrying the weight of her president's words. Traoré's chest tightened. He pressed the phone to his heart, overcome with emotion. It wasn't the debates of politicians or the headlines of newspapers that mattered most. It was this, a child in a forgotten corner of the world, finding courage in his voice. He looked at his aides, his eyes wet. "This," he said softly, "is why we must never bow." At that moment, he understood. The fight was no longer his alone. It belonged to his people. On the 6th day, Traoré walked into another high-profile meeting filled with diplomats, journalists, and businessmen. Whispers followed him through the hall like a shadow. Everyone wanted to see if he would retreat, if the fire of his words had cooled. When he stepped to the podium, the room stilled, cameras clicked, all eyes locked on him. He didn't raise his voice. He simply spoke of dignity, sacrifice, and the right of small nations to be respected. But then something unexpected happened. A few leaders, quiet at first, rose to applaud him. Others followed, the sound of clapping growing until the hall shook with respect. Even those who disagreed couldn't deny it. This young president had captured the world's attention. He wasn't speaking only for Burkina Faso anymore. He was speaking for every forgotten voice, every silenced people. Harris sat still, her face unreadable. But the silence around her told the story. Traoré had transformed humiliation into honor and doubt into unshakable respect. The world had just witnessed a moment of history. In Ouagadougou, the capital overflowed with people pouring into the streets. From dusty alleys to open markets, they carried flags, drums, and torches. Women ululated in joy. Men raised their fists. Children climbed on rooftops chanting his name. Radio stations played his speech until their voices cracked. Churches and mosques echoed with prayers of thanks. Families held hands and wept, not in sadness, but in a pride so overwhelming it felt like a dream. One mother said, "For years they told us Africa had no voice. Today, my son saw proof that we do." Her tears fell as she lifted her child high into the air. Across the continent, leaders and ordinary people alike felt a stirring in their hearts. They saw themselves in Traoré's calm defiance, his steady voice, his unshakable dignity. The world debated, critics talked, but the people of Burkina Faso didn't care. To them, their leader had already won. He had restored something priceless, hope, and that hope spread like wildfire, reaching hearts in places he had never stepped. On the 7th day, Traoré prepared to return home. His convoy rolled toward the airport as reporters shouted questions. He gave no grand speeches. He didn't need to. His silence carried the weight of everything already said. At the airport, he paused before boarding. Looking into the sea of cameras, he spoke only one final sentence. "Respect is not given by power. It is earned by truth." Those words echoed worldwide. They were printed on posters, shared on millions of screens, and carried on the lips of children across Africa. That night, in villages and cities, families gathered again. They replayed the video not once, but dozens of times. Each time, their hearts swelled with tears, pride, and courage. For them, this wasn't just politics. It was proof that even in a world of giants, the voice of the small could roar with dignity. And as the week closed, one truth became clear. Ibrahim Traoré had not only defended his people, he had changed history. Dear viewers, if this story touched your heart, don't just leave quietly. Click like to honor courage. Hit subscribe so you never miss stories that inspire. And most importantly, drop a comment. Tell the world how this moment made you feel. Let's flood the comments with pride, with tears, with unity, so the spirit of this story never dies.